Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm your host for today's program, in which we will discuss China's presence in Africa, spotlighting in particular the perspectives that different stakeholders on the continent hold of that presence. Co-leading our discussion today is my colleague, Mentate Mloshwa. How are you doing today, Mentate?
I'm great, Jeff. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, as a way of refreshing your memory to our listeners and viewers today, the Resistance Bureau focuses on the major threats to human rights and human dignity while shining a light on the enduring struggles for freedom. This program features the leaders at the forefront of these critical fights, the activists and human rights defenders, the politicians, journalists, as well as thought leaders and academics, and we seek to build solidarity and networks among them. Indeed, what you see on the show today is only a portion of the overall work being done. It is in this spirit that we are joined today by a truly remarkable panel of experts. First, we have Bright Akwer, a Pan-African artist based in Ghana, who works at the critical cross-sections of satire, street art, and illustration to provoke debate and unapologetically expose political hypocrisies. We are also joined by Hannah Ryder, a former diplomat and economist from Kenya. She is the CEO of Development Reimagined, an award-winning African-led consultancy group that works with various stakeholders to strengthen their China-Africa policies, among many other issues. Third, we have Nsetse Were, an expert on China-Africa relations on which she has published extensively. She is a development economist who works with and advises African governments, the private sector, and development institutions to help them navigate the complex realities of African economies. And finally, Yushane Wu. She's a South African research fellow at the University of Pretoria, a respected scholar and a rising academic star, who has written on China's approach to media and public diplomacy in Africa. Today, she will help to lead our Q&A session with our colleague Nick Cheeseman. Hey, Nick, how are you feeling today?
Hey, Jeff, looking forward to this one.
Fantastic. And I'm also going to put you on the spot. What are you most looking forward to today?
Well, I'm really interested in hearing Bright talk about his his images and his ideas, which have really inspired a big debate. But I think we have three brilliant speakers and a fantastic discussion. So I'm also interested in the questions that our panelists are going to be asking each other.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nick. And be sure to all of you listening today to follow us on Twitter at Resist Bureau and use the hashtag Resist Bureau Live for today and for future shows. We are also streaming on Facebook Live and YouTube right now and recording the show for later distribution, which will be available for download on Apple Podcasts. Mentade, before we turn to today's discussion and today's speakers, please, if you would, set the scene for us.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm very excited about today's topic, and I'm actually very glad that we're having it. So we're basically having this conversation because China is in Africa, and the presence of China is becoming more prominent in the continent. There's so many heated debates around the role and influence of this presence on the continent. As it stands, Africa's largest trading partner is China, and recently China established its first mission to the African Union. China offers loans, grant, development deals that often do not have the strings attached that are normally favored by the West. One of the standing debates around this non-interference policy is the idea that China's economic might is actually used to roll back democratic progress. Supporting this standpoint as well is existing research that shows a strong relationship between increasing Chinese aid and state violence. However, this debate is largely framed by the global north and is met with a lot of suspicion and hesitancy, where a lot of citizens in Africa feel that it's a Western China conversation or catfight that we're just being pulled into involuntarily. However, where citizens are involved, there's a conversation around the mistreatment of locals by Chinese companies and the growing presence of Chinese locals in local markets. This is soon to be associated with the importation of skilled labor from China, where locals are given the less skilled labor roles and they're unfairly compensated, although this is not always clearly indicating that Chinese companies have worse practices compared to other multinationals. There's also been outcries between communities that are displaced to make room for those Chinese companies. And in some mining areas, homes have been destroyed when Chinese companies come in to mine in local communities. In some cases, African citizens have cried foul that the government does not put their interests at the forefront by defending Chinese nationals and by continuing to sign deals with China. This show seeks to unpack the narrative of the China-Africa relationship by focusing mostly on the lived realities and views of people within the continent. We're having experts that are joining us today that are working in civil society, media, the arts, as well as academia, that directly interact that really interact with the impact of the growing China-Africa relationship. We feel that this is important a discussion because it takes it away from this Western savior culture that has a significant number of Africans feeling that the global North think itself having the parental responsibility to save Africa from China. One of the ways in which we started this conversation or this narrative shaping that is more focused on African perspective is by having Bright actually showcase some of his work, which is focused on showing the Africa-China relationship through a satirical piece that we shared online. Reactions to this piece have been very diverse and varied and actually show what we're trying to say, that there's a lot of people that feel that the existing discourse and narrative is a Western narrative, which is why we feel that we need to have a more African narrative. Remember that you can engage us on YouTube and Facebook through the comments section and also by sending us questions via WhatsApp line. Our WhatsApp number is +263 776 238 199. It's also available on the screen right now in case you missed it. So Jeff, I'm going to throw you in so that you bring in our panelists.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And as mentioned, we had a fantastic artist involved in this show, Bright Akwer from Ghana. I think we're going to bring you in first, Bright, because as Mentade mentioned in her intro, the satirical pieces that you produced for the show really did spark a lot of discussion on especially on our social media platforms. So I'd like to open this up to you. Tell our listeners today about your work and what was on your mind specifically while you were working on the pieces, the two specific pieces that we shared. What messages were you hoping to convey? And lastly, and relatedly, how does this work square with your lived experiences in Ghana, whose government, as we know, has a deep and long-standing relationship with the Chinese Communist Party going back all the way to the 1960s. So Bright, the floor is yours. Bright, I actually think you're on mute right now if you want to unmute yourself. I think you're still having some volume troubles on your side. Actually, while you get that sorted out, in Setse, if you're with us, I know we definitely have some questions for you while Bright sorts out his technical difficulties on your side. You know, we wanted to bring you in early into this discussion as well, just because your work within the subject of African economies specifically is so expensive. And the China-African relationship is built on the economic muscle of China, the superpower. So can you tell us, you know, and help us understand in layman's terms what China does in Africa and some of the impacts of this economic relationship, if you could?
Sure, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I think first of all, I want to correct a misperception that Chinese firms and companies are in the business of hiring their own. This is one of the biggest fallacies that has been espoused by media narratives in the global North. So I think we need to just understand that in the process of this conversation, we'll be debunking a lot of just factual inaccuracies. I mean, well, okay, so the China-Africa economic relationship has been successful because China premised its engagement on the economic priorities that had been articulated by African governments. So whereas the European or North American approach was a value-led approach, supposedly in terms of trying to support human rights and governance, although the precedent that Africa has of Europe and North American behavior is not one that tallies with that narrative or that ideological bet that currently seems to drive engagement, right? The precedent that Africa has is one of slavery and colonization, the Cold War, and circular adjustment programs. So let me just preface that reality. So one of the reasons why China became so big with African governments so quickly economically is that it met the economic, commercial, and financial priorities that a lot of African governments had that had been overlooked by European and North American governments, particularly infrastructure financing. So the state-to-state relationship has been dominated by that. But in addition to that, the trade relationship started to happen at a time when Africa was just coming out of the structural adjustment program. We had been forced to open our economies. And then, so obviously, as China had been building out its industrial muscle, Africa became a very ripe market for the imports of Chinese goods and services. And just to be clear, China is not the only biggest import market for Africa. It's the biggest import. Europe imports the most from China as well as the USA. So it's not like this is a uniquely African story. But I think on the private sector side, and I'll let others come in with their comments, China has also been making significant headway in terms of private investment into the continent. And this misnomer that all Chinese private investment is backed by the state is yet another fallacy. So one of the things I think you should bear in mind is that on the state side, in addition to the lack of a historical stain that has informed the tone of Europe and North American governments when interacting with African governments, the decision for the Chinese state, particularly to center the view of African governments, and let me be clear, the centering is of African governments. We're not talking about African peoples or private sector, right? Because they're different agents in this conversation, is one of the reasons why their statecraft has been so effective. And the impact of, particularly as I'll focus on the state-to-state, lending has been mixed. I mean, obviously the concerns we have around fiscal opacity, hidden debt, contingent liabilities, these are all very real. The social and environmental issues that were alluded to, but they've also the Chinese investments have created a lot of jobs. They've shortened traveling time within African countries. They've connected Africa regionally. And so in a country like Kenya, one of the big arteries that was financed by the Chinese government has been a conduit for reducing economic inequality between regions because of that infrastructure. They're also updating the ability to geotag infrastructure. And more importantly, they're enabling a lot of knowledge and skill transfer in a very young population. I mean, this is just a snapshot of the impact. So I think I would encourage a step away from a one-dimensional view of what the impact of Chinese lending and activity, and sort of have a bit more of a comprehensive eye on what's going on there.
Thank you so much, Anzeze. I love, I think, the focus or the emphasis on the need for a balanced perspective, because I think it offers the kind of objective narrative that a lot of people feel is missing. But the other thing is that you've written a lot around how the Western economic approach to Africa is impractical, because it assumes that everyone thinks that the world is a better place if Western powers remain in charge. If we concede that there is indeed a biased global order on one side, then the presence of China appears to be a positive factor, because it creates more space for African agency. Based on your research, how can Africans best use this space to communicate their needs, aspirations, and economic priorities to benefit them in the long term?
Oh, that's to me. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that African agency comes from different sources. It's not coordinated and it's not in co-agreement. So this notion of a single Africa agency is one that's not practical and lived out in real terms, right? You've got the African states, which are not coordinated within themselves, and they're not in co-agreement within themselves in terms of what they want from China. You've got the African private sector that has its own view and priorities on what it would like from China and the feelings that it has towards China. And then you'd have sort of what I'd call the general African populace. Those are not who are not necessarily actively involved in the economic or financial deals with China, but are obviously impacted by them. And that agency is not coordinated or in core agreement. And that's why when you have these different perception monitors on the US and China and Africa, you get a different answer each time, because I guess they're asking different people and they're asking different questions. But I think the real opportunity we have is to center an African view and to center a perspective from Africa in the understanding that it is one that will have to be negotiated and compromised, and that some agency may be counterproductive to what we view as positive development goals within Africa. And there's some agency that will obviously be aligned with a vision of a equitable, sustainable, and frankly, healthy Africa. And so that is really the nux of the matter, is how to leverage the ability to center African agency in its multifarious forms in a multipolar world. So that's really what the game changer is with China. It is now a multipolar world, and the bipolarity and unipolarity actually that occurred after the Cold War is no longer the case.
Thank you so much, Nsetse, for that insight. I think we have Bright back with us. Bright, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. We're
Wow.
glad that worked out. I know we had initially led with you and asked a first question, but just to refresh your memory and those who might be listening, we had mentioned the art pieces you created for the show and how they generated so much discussion. So we wanted to ask you, what was on your mind while you were working on them? What were their titles, and how did they sort of manifest in your mind? What messages were you hoping to convey, and how does this really live? Or square rather with your lived experiences in Ghana. We'd really love to hear your insights on that.
Wow, thank you very much. For one, this whole issue about the Chinese relationship with the government of Ghana and the people of Ghana is one that really, really caught my attention in 2017. And at the time, it was already a very big discussion on the radio about how small scale mining in Ghana suddenly began to explode. And this was because there were a lot of Chinese nationals coming into Ghana to explore that field, and they had all these manner of sophisticated equipment which they were using to mine on our river, several rivers which even till date are still damaged. And um, I just thought it was very, very important that everybody contributed to the conversation, because it's directly threatened the water supply in Ghana. And as an artist who had already started making work in social commentary, I thought I could make an art piece that could get people talking about it, because I realized this was a topic that uh, certain state actors or state agencies did not want people getting involved in. So since 2017, I've been making different pieces initially talking about this illegal small scale mining, which is which has now been made illegal, or is supposed to have been made illegal, and the various responses to that, and generally what the conversation is around. Sometimes just my peers, the way the government, the relationship with China, and a whole lot. There are a whole lot of things that have inspired my work. And for one, I like how when my work goes on social media, it's able to generate varied discussions, because as one would expect, there are varied reactions to all these stories, especially when there also seems to be state-sponsored censorship for these kinds of conversations. So personally, I've had experiences where some of my work have been denied exhibition space in galleries because people felt the subjects were too touchy, or some of the characters captured in my painting could maybe enact some kind of retaliation action against them, and so on. But generally, I've found that satire has become a very, very good way of getting people relaxed enough to talk about these things. So it's one of the strategies that I've employed, and it seems to be working for me. What am I thinking when I create these things? Uh, Initially, I'm looking for answers. I guess everybody's looking for answers. What are we doing about these direct threats to the quality of our life?
Yeah.
It's very, very direct, and yet it seems like people don't want to talk about it. Personally, I've seen how some of the mainstream media channels who started talking about these things have suddenly changed the tone with which they report. And I've also been privy to conversations where the Chinese diplomats in Ghana have literally threatened the Ghanaian government to put a stop or dictate how the media is supposed to report on these issues. They've also called for the state to censor my work, which I find very.
Right. Are you still with us? I think we lost you there for a second. Yep. Please go ahead. You were talking about censorship.
Yeah, it's it was interesting in 2000 and 2016 when the Chinese diplomats in Ghana held a press conference to address what they called was unfair reportage in the media about the activities of Chinese nationals in Ghana. And they literally threatened the Ghanaian government to censor the media and to censor my cartoons because they thought these were defaming their leaders in Ghana and back home in China. But personally, I found all these things interesting and inspiring because they've continued to inspire my creation of new work and sometimes help me decide more effective strategies with which to share my work. Because one of my goals is to get um, as many people exposed to my visions and my work as possible. And at a time when it seems like galleries are blocking my showing of some of these pieces, you know, I've tried to find more creative ways of getting more people to see my work and have more people have access to it, because I think the conversations that they seek to inspire are things that affect all of us in very, very direct ways.
Thank you so much, Bright. I think the one statement that really stood out for me was the idea that in your work, you're looking for answers. And I think that's very, very important. Part of the conversation, or rather the triggered reactions on social media around your piece, was the idea that it's a Western driven or Western funded perspective. And a lot of people, even like on WhatsApp, would just be sharing that they feel that anything that is far from what they've seen or their government is driving is a Western funded idea or perspective. So they somehow brush this aside as the West are just panicking over China's growth. But I wanted to speak into, I would love for you to speak into the role that you have as a creator, because you already mentioned how your work triggers conversation. You want to see your work taking up space, even in places where you are being censored and being stopped from showcasing your work. I think looking at the continent in general, where do you see young creators or creators in general coming in and using their art to shape this China-Africa narrative in a more objective and honest way?
Wow. I definitely get those similar reactions to anytime I create work. I have friends on my social media channels, and mind you, social media still happens to be uh, the most open space for me to share my work on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. And anytime I put anything up that closely resembles me asking for accountability of the Ghanaian government in the way they deal with just everybody else, and especially with China, I get these kind of criticisms that, oh, your work is Western propaganda and it's a Western funded research. But no, I think if personally, if I feel I have the right to make commentary on just anything at all, then everyone should also have the rights to respond in any ways that um, they feel or they think they should. Whether my position aligns with a Western entity or a Western actor or not, the effects of the things that I'm speaking about should, in the least, interest people like myself. I mean, Africans, young Africans on the continent who have creative ways of communicating people, using the arts, music, film, photography, painting. You know, the onus falls on us really, because whatever decisions come out of whatever futures come out of the decisions that are made on our behalf now, you know, we are the ones who are going to have to face it head on. So I invite all those criticisms. I think, if anything at all, it means the conversation is healthy, and I have been open to hearing these things. Uh, Earlier this year, I had an exhibition that I called Propaganda, and this was just because one of the very interested people who often sees my work called my work a piece of Western propaganda.
It seems like we lost our friend Bright again. But actually, while he was speaking, Mentade, he reminded me, And I should remind our viewers that we did an entire program not too long ago on the art of resistance. We had a poet from South Africa. We had a DJ Switch from Nigeria, one of your colleagues from Zimbabwe, and a cartoonist from Tanzania, Gado, that really talked about a lot of the issues that Bright was bringing up. So I definitely urge our listeners today to go check out that episode on our website, which to this day is still one of my favorites that we've done. But right now, without further ado, if Hannah is still with us and she's not experiencing technical difficulties, Hannah, I'd love to bring you in here and talk about another touchy subject within this broader realm of China and Africa. And that is the fact that China often gives aid directly to authoritarian regimes. Of course, they're not alone in doing so. But in doing so, these more abusive, oppressive regimes are allowed to use this aid as they wish. There are no strings attached, as it were. And as we know, this policy can have really dire consequences. For example, in the lead up to the show, we were looking at some of the literature that was available, and we came across several studies that actually showed when Chinese aid to a country increases, political violence rates involving state forces also increase. So if indeed Chinese aid can lead to increased levels of state violence, what can be done to mitigate this effect, if anything, in your opinion? And how do these considerations factor into your work when you're advising partners on development projects and related initiatives in Africa? We'd really like your insights on that.
Great. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's been great to hear comments from my old friend Anzetse and also be inspired by what Bright's doing. I think it's great. I think it's very important to have expression of these different experiences and to also, I think the arts world is understanding and trying to get to the core of what's going on. Look, I think, so I want to go back to kind of some basics, Jeff, if you don't mind, because I think it's there's a lot of misunderstanding about China as a development partner, China as a financer, and often, we are framing these issues are framed in a way in which they really remove the idea of agency, something which Anzetse was talking about. When we say, is China giving money to dictators? Is China doing, X, Y, and Z? We're not really thinking about, well, who is on the other side? Who actually is? We're not clearly taking that into account. It's also important to bear in mind that when we talk about aid from China, it's managed in a very, very different. Even loans from China are managed in a very different way to what people think or what people know, for example, of how British aid or American aid or French aid is managed. In fact, in many cases, in most cases, there are no government transfers that actually happen of money, which is people might be surprised to hear this. But for instance, if you have a stadium which is being built, it's a Chinese firm who will typically build the stadium. The finances kept within China. It's paid within China to that firm to make it happen. They might buy some local materials, etc., but that's really up to the firm. It's not like a direct government transfer in the same way that, for example, before Anzetse was talking about structural adjustment, but around that sort of time, there used to be something called budget support, which was very popular, especially from Europe. That just doesn't happen from China. Even with loans, they are typically specifically for a specific project. They're tied to something which has a feasibility study behind it, which will tend to be, we can go and talk about what problems they have with those feasibility studies, but nevertheless, there's usually a kind of productive element or an expectation of productive element behind it. Now, that doesn't mean that the projects, for instance, can't be then taking place in certain places, for instance, and delivered in certain places which are linked to political leaders. Like you say, there is evidence for that sort of thing. And of course, I'm an economist by training, so I also know that, we can do all sorts of things with statistics. But nevertheless, again, given the way that the Chinese aid system works, what tends to happen is that, for instance, it's a negotiation between a government to an African government or an Asian government, negotiation between them and the Chinese government to decide, for example, where things are going to happen, what's going to be done, etc. There's usually a list from the African side. These are the kinds of projects that we like. And then the Chinese partner says, well, yeah, we're willing to help on this one. We think this one will work, this one won't work, etc., etc. So, and again, that is not the way that, and I've worked in development for 20 years, that's not the way that a bilateral partner like UK, France, or US would necessarily work. UK might actually, in many cases, will come up with some ideas, then put them to the government, and sometimes not even go through governments. So there's pros and cons of different approaches. On the one side, what we find, for instance, and our research finds, is that on the one side you have projects which are very much kind of tied to productive outcomes, etc., from the Chinese side, which are financed by China with Chinese finance. They also then the leakage, in a sense, in the system is not as strong. On the other hand, in terms of things like involving civil society or involving even kind of local private sector, that's just not really there. Whereas on the other side, with approaches from other development partners, you will tend to see that those financing streams might be involving civil society, etc. They will be kind of linked to a lot of social goals, education, health, etc., but then not necessarily focused and linked directly to a national development plan or what the government is aiming for, and can even in some cases kind of crowd it out. So there is so much complexity about this, and I think this is one of the key messages that I wanted to share with you today, because I think too often there are so many, the way that the China-Africa relationship is described, and even by Africans, we ourselves, we underplay our own agency, we underplay the role of governments and what our governments do. And yes, we have good and bad governments, but that's the world over. And then we also have, we really just don't benchmark the Chinese relationship against others. We kind of look at it as if it's just one thing and there's nothing else around. And honestly, there are pros and cons. That's really that's the key message I want to share with you today. There's so much more complexity. There's no black and white to it.
Thank you so much, Hannah. You mentioned a lot of things that I think are very important. I think what I'm getting away from your submission is just, the constant reflection that we need people to, pass this conversation from a place of being informed. And I think from a lot of things that you've mentioned around just how the system works for China when it decides to invest in Africa, a lot of us don't understand that. A lot of people, the laymen, don't understand that, but we still show up to give an opinion. So I think it's very important, like you say, that people come from a place of knowledge. So the next question that I was going to ask you had a lot to do with just the hesitancy around the way that the global north is driving the narrative. So I think I would want to still come back and ask to say, do you see the global north having a role in potentially just this Africa-China relationship narrative in the continent? But also on the flip side, I think one of the questions I have is around just the place of ordinary citizens, because the government has a role, but citizens also have a role. Where do you see citizens fitting in?
Yeah, I think, it is a very important question. And I see somebody in the audience has also picked that up as something really important. So again, we have to go back to understand the Chinese system, perhaps more so than we do have to understand the global north system. And I honestly, I find it quite difficult talking about certain categories of countries. In our kind of style guide and development reimagined, we talk about kind of high income, low income, middle income countries, just because at least that's sort of factual. And the kind of movement between global north and global south is just, and today I was talking about BRICS and so on, about, are they global north? Are they global south? What are they? Are they emerging? It's so difficult anyway. But I think the key point here and about the civil society aspect, and kind of engaging in that. I think how is the global north involved? So from civil society, I think one of the key aspects about the Chinese expectation with regards to how they're working with other governments is that their view is other governments have to decide, are going to decide how they want to engage with their own civil societies. It is not on the Chinese government's perspective, nor on its kind of view to interfere with the process of how governments want to engage with their civil society. So, and it's always deferential to that. So, for example, we were talking about aid earlier on, but let's talk a little bit about loans, because I know that comes up a lot. A country like Cameroon has a particular law in place which says that all of its contracts need to be published. So Cameroon publishes its contracts, and it publishes the contracts with Chinese organizations. And so civil society can go and have a look at those. They can say, well, this isn't any good, that is, etc. All these sorts of things. But many other African countries don't do that. So it is really a case of, from the Chinese perspective, it's we will respect whatever you decide. But it is also then the agency is therefore with the African government. The African government is expected, as far as they think, to then engage with civil society. Now, of course, we have many governments that don't engage with civil society, but I think the Chinese point of view would be that's our own problem to deal with, and we need to come to a point where we decide that's exactly what our political systems in many ways are meant to be designed to do. So just to also understand that point, I think, and again, if there's things like environmental, social safeguards, all those sorts of things, again, that's for the African governments to decide and to put in place. Those sorts of controls are for them to decide, which is also why in Development Reimagined, and I'll finish in a minute, is what we really try to encourage. And again, I was speaking about it earlier on with regards to Zambia, for example, is encouraging African governments and others to coordinate more, to learn from each other, to kind of exchange experience, and to really drive a race to the top, really, not only from China, but also from other development partners who honestly, no one is doing well. No one is doing great, to be honest. They all can do so much better from the African perspective. And I think that's what we really need to be doing much more. And that's what civil society accountability should also be oriented around, I hope.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was super, super informative. So thank you for your submission. And thanks to all of our speakers so far for such an incredibly rich discussion so far. And right now, kudos to all of our speakers. We're right on time. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Nick Cheeseman, and today's fantastic discussant, Yusheng Wu, to get their reactions and also to curate the questions that we received through our WhatsApp channel and on social media. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. Great discussion so far, and really overjoyed today to be joined by a brilliant South African research fellow, Yusheng Wu, at the University of Pretoria, who is very highly regarded, a highly respected scholar who's written extensively on China's approach to media and public diplomacy in Africa, and recently co-edited the book South Africa-China Relations, A Partnership of Paradoxes, which sounds, without putting too many words in your mouth, like a great summary of some of the points that we've heard so far today of our panelists bringing complexity to this issue where so often stereotypes reign. But you're the expert here, not me. So before I put some questions to the panelists that will come in from the audience, I want to go over to you, Shan, for any insights you have, any comments you'd like to make to draw out general points. And if you want to put any specific questions to our panelists, please do so. To the panelists, just so you know, while Yushen's speaking, you can see the questions I'm going to ask you in a minute. I put them in the private chat. So if you want to get a sneak peek and start preparing your answers, they're in the chat for you now. Yushen, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on the show, and good evening and good day to everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here and to hear all the speakers today. And I think just like the speakers, I really want to emphasize the complexity of this Africa-China relationship and perhaps also build on what has been said so far. From the contributions, what I can draw, because the speakers are all practitioners as well as people with lived experiences in this relationship, what we can see is that the Africa-China relationship is actually not a single relationship, but it is a set of relationships. And I think this is important to highlight because often this relationship is viewed in such binary terms, right? So overly positive, or there's a lot of skepticism towards it. But I think the reality is always something in between. And for example, if you had to just follow the headlines in South Africa regarding the South Africa-China relationship, I think one would deduce that the relationship is largely based on trade relations, and then the occasional emotive headlines such as illicit trade, and then there is nothing in between. So I have a few comments, and this is largely regarding, I suppose, the state and society relationship. I think it's come up quite a bit. And I guess the question is, first of all, I mean, and maybe someone else would be able to answer with their perspective, is China an anomaly? I think a lot of recent surveys have also reflected that there isn't a large discrepancy when it comes to African perspectives towards China and other continental partners such as the US. And I really like to cite the 2021 Afrobarometer survey, because they surveyed, I think, citizens in over 34 African countries. And one of the findings that they found was that when it came to perspectives towards China and the US, both were almost equal in terms of positive economic and political influence, according to African perspectives. So I think China stood at 63% and the US at 60%. Yet the overriding narrative is this power competition. I think what is interesting about hearing African citizens' perspectives is also that they don't always diametrically oppose, African policymakers and their engagement with China. But I would also add an immediate caveat here is that there isn't, of course, always alignment between government and society. And what I really find so interesting about the Africa-China topic is how often this relationship is a window into the intricacies and politics within African societies themselves. And I'll give an example in South Africa. I think in 2018, opposition parties threatened to take the South African government to court because they had not disclosed the a loan agreement with China that had to do with the national power utility here in South Africa. Interestingly, the Chinese partner later on refused to provide further funding to the national utility because they were worried that the South African side could not deliver on these projects. So I think what's quite fascinating in this example is that sometimes accountability also comes on both sides. And then one last thing that I wanted to add, and I think this came up in the questions as well as I think pre-discussions to the event, which is this correlation between dealing with China and the transfer of values such as governance. And yes, of course, I think certain regimes engage China purely because they understand that it is less prescriptive. But I think there's another perspective here, which is that Africans are not just uncritical and take, what they're given. And again, if I go back to this Afrobarometer survey, I think what was interesting is that while there is this view that China's economic influence is positive, this did not correlate with the kind of governance options that citizens favor. So for example, I think about 70% still opted for certain democratic values, such as the ability to choose leaders specifically through elections, as well as agreeing that there should be presidential term limits. And then finally, I think the last point then is really that, again, comes back to the agency discussion, that the receiving environment also has a strong influence on the manner in which Chinese actors can act. So again, I think in March this year, the South African government took Huawei, the Chinese telecoms company, to court for not hiring enough locals as per law. Or I think more recently, we know that President Kagame of Rwanda actually deported a few Chinese nationals and jailed another to almost, I think, 20 years for seriously mistreating Rwandan workers. So I think I will leave it there for now, and hopefully the speakers have something to add as well. Thanks very much.
Sorry, maybe I was on mute for you there. I'm going to throw back to you now. So thanks so much for those great comments from our discussant. I think, again, somebody really helping us to see shades of grey and what's often depicted unhelpfully as a black and white relationship. I'm going to now throw the questions to you, to the speakers that I put in the private chat. And also, please feel free to respond to anything that Yushan said just there. So these are questions that have come in one or two cases. They're word-for-word questions that have come in from our audience, which is across Africa and the world. In a couple of cases, merged questions together to try and capture all of the issues that people wanted to speak to. So here are the questions. Anzetsu, where do you think the negative stereotypes of China have come from? At the beginning of the show, Mentale talked about Western governments criticizing China and generating negative narratives, which is of course true. But a lot of what I've seen recently, and I think we can see some of it in the chat today about China taking over ports and mines in return for failed debt, is actually seems to be sort of local rumors with local spurs that are predominantly African rather than Western. So the question here is where do those kind of anti-Chinese rumors come from? Who's producing them and who's trying to push these narratives and for what purposes? Hannah, question that came in here over WhatsApp. Do you perceive any notable diffusion of some of the main characteristics that we might say define Beijing's model to African states? This doesn't just have to be about, the kind of obvious issue around democracy and authoritarianism. It could be about domestic politics. It could be about development models. It could be about communication models and so on. So do you see sort of evidence of diffusion and the borrowing of ideas? Bright, final question here for you. Your art seems to focus more on the economic side of the China-Africa relationship, as did some of your comments. Have you thought about the role of authoritarian powers abroad in promoting the censorship of artists like you, for example, by supporting government efforts to clamp down on social media and hack into the phones of opposition leaders? How can you use art to speak to issues like this? And then I'll throw in a final thought for myself. I think everybody's absolutely right that no one's necessarily doing a perfect job. I think Hannah said that. It's clear that there's hypocrisy and inconsistency, on all sides of the international donor engagement in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a number of reports that have come out recently suggesting that the European Union and other European and Western states promote security more than they promote democracy. So it's not the case that everybody is going out there to promote democracy. And it's really important to keep that in mind. But I guess my question would be, have we now got to a point in international relations where we expect and at least hope that governments do better? So to go back to Hannah's point, it's absolutely true that it's down to African governments how they treat their civil society. It's absolutely true it's down to them how they treat their medias, and it's absolutely true it's down to them how they treat the proceeds of these resources. But do we want to be in a situation where we genuinely say to China and the UK and the US, don't worry, you know that 90% of what you're producing and giving to the country is being stolen, just keep going? Or do we actually expect all of those countries to actually start to pay more attention to the needs of the citizens of the countries rather than the governments, and to be more concerned if the resources and investments they're making aren't helping civil society, ordinary citizens, so on and so on? Have we got to a point where we're actually not willing to accept it's not our fault, it's the African government's responsibility, we'll just be this passive force? Do we actually need something like a more constructive engagement over the next 10, 15 years? So, throwing that back, Bright, you up first, so perhaps we'll come to you, and then we'll come to the other speakers, and then also, Yushan, if you want to come in just at the end before we go back to our hosts, I'll give you an opportunity to have the last word. So over to you, speakers, starting with Bright. Bright, I think you might be on mute. I can't hear you still, I'm afraid. Okay, perhaps we'll go to Hannah while we try and get Bright back. Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And some great points. And I even want to respond myself to some of the comments that others have made. Look, you asked specifically about models coming out of China. Honestly, I have to say, I think there's very, very little understanding of the Chinese model, of development, the Chinese model of politics. And I think partly that is because of language. It's also partly because obviously colonial ties are not there, distance, etc. But there, I think, to the degree that there are, of course, some governments that are closer to China than others. There are countries that, for example, if we're talking about development, that use special economic zones, all these sorts of things, which were used in China, but also used elsewhere in Asia. In fact, were initially an African invention back in 1971, but then delivered better in Asia. So many of these, even when those types of models are then when countries try to deliver them, even the way that China has delivered them successfully is still very, very misunderstood. It's not well articulated even by organizations. We're trying to fill that gap, but it's not easy. It's not easy to explain. Now, of course, there are points at which you could say, well, some of that knowledge, maybe we don't want that knowledge to be there. I mean, I don't know who the we is, but I think what I would say, and I think what we work on really is to try to ensure that there is as much information about the different types of options of different types of models. And I think it's important for countries to be able to compare them and to compare them impartially, including comparing them within the continent. So it's not just about, is China this kind of model, but actually even understanding within Africa, what does an autocratic regime really mean? What does a democratic regime? We don't even have one model in any case. So I think it's too simplistic an idea, but I also do think that there's so much more information and understanding to be had between China and Africa, and Chinese people, African people on these questions. Nick, I just also wanted to mention one very kind of brief point. You were talking about, kind of should the sort of big picture, should countries just say, well, off you go, governments, go spend this money. In a way, kind of, yes. That's what a mutually respectful relationship is. And a mutually respectful relationship, it doesn't expect that there would be a 90% leakage or 90% corruption. And I don't know what evidence we have or anybody has to say that there's a 90% corruption kind of on any of these projects. And many development partners, they design projects to avoid exactly these sorts of issues. That's exactly why, for example, budget support went out of fashion, because there was so much leakage, and the kind of accountability with regards to it. But there's still many people, including myself, who still think that is the best way of delivering development finance. China doesn't actually kind of come into that, but many development professionals like myself do believe it is the best way, because it does give the greatest opportunity for governments to make decisions, and then for citizens to be accountable to them. But it's a big conversation, and I just think it can't just be related to China, Africa. It's something much bigger.
Absolutely, that's a great point. I guess the question partly is about whether or not we're interested in that relationship between states and states, or states and people, and the extent to which we want to kind of think about individuals, or whether we think about states and the sovereignty level. But I think you're absolutely right in all of the points that you make there. So moving on quickly, because I see that we're starting to get a bit short on time. And Setsi, so your question was, where do the negative stereotypes of China come from? Mentade talked about Western governments criticizing China, but a lot of what we see is driven by local concerns, such as false rumors that China's about to take ports or mines to reclaim debt. And then I think you've also seen some of the comments about Djibouti that have been coming up in the questions on the right-hand side of the screen. So would you like to take those all together?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I just want to echo Hannah's points about, governance and governments. And if, just to the point that you're making, Nick, if that's the tone, then the tone should go all the way back to the Cold War, when Europe, the US, and Russia actively sabotaged the desire of African populations to have governments that were accountable to them. Because once a government chose the East or the West, it was like, well, we don't really care what happens to governance. So I think do bear in mind that the emphasis on human rights and governance, it's a very new thing. This is not the traditional way that the West has treated us. So I think to the point about the debt, first of all, I think that misperception comes from a different value system that China brings to the table that goes against a Eurocentric norm that, quite frankly, is quite archaic and not rooted in an African view. So when the Chinese, for example, make decisions on who to lend to, they're not using some rule of law or governance model. They have a completely different set of criteria that they use to determine whether or not they're going to invest in a country, and that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly valid, and it's fine for Europe and North America to have their criteria. China does not have that criteria. So because they're not taking this Eurocentric view, that is immediately seen as some sort of penalization code, which is actually not true. But I think the real thing is the consumption of media that Africans do. I mean, Africans consume media from Europe and North America. They do not necessarily consume media from China. And we know that media from North America and Europe is very xenophobic, very much pitching a great power competition and really trying to create a sense of meeting foreign policy objectives through communications. Because of that, a lot of the just factually inaccurate lies that are spun, particularly around the debt trap narrative. I've disproven it and looked into it. Hannah and her organization have looked at it. Just about every serious scholar in Africa has looked into the debt trap narrative. Right now it's Djibouti. Last month it was Uganda. Before that it was Kenya. At no point has there been any proof that that's true. But because this narrative is so persistent and it shows up in local media, and frankly, local media also begins to assume that there's some fact to it because it's being said so often, then you get this sense that it's a local concern and it starts showing up locally. That does not mean it's not misinformation. It's flagrant misinformation that sort of is geared towards certain foreign policy objectives. But I think the bigger thing is the sin of omission. The sin of omission that the appetite that African governments have for debt is driven by African governments. It is not China or anyone giving African governments debt. It is an appetite from African governments. And in fact, I'd encourage those who are serious looking into economics to look at the latest IMF report on Africa, which says what we've been saying the whole time. The bulk of that debt is being met by private creditors, domestic private creditors, and international private creditors. It's not really being met in bulk by bilaterals such as China or the US. So I think that sense of the African governments are not on their own using their agency to accrue debt. I think this is fallacious. But I think I'll also say that the one-dimensional way in which the negative elements of Chinese lending is highlighted, but not the same highlight being seen on the negative impacts of some of the European and North American activity in Africa. So of course, rightfully, human rights and civil society organizations point out when there are serious social and human rights violations, environmental violations, as they should. And we do want that accountability to continue. But what happens to all the human rights conversations on what fishery European trawlers are doing in West African fish stocks? Suddenly that's not there. Or what oil companies have been doing in Nigeria, or what chocolate companies have been doing in Cote d'Ivoire, or just the other day, what mining companies have been doing in Congo. So the one-dimensionality of this shining of a spotlight just on Chinese atrocities, and not that balanced view of, well, actually Africa has been pillaged by Europe and North America and continues to be pillaged in some ways by Europe and North America, creates this sense that China is a larger threat than it is. And so I really do encourage, those who are serious about trying to understand this relationship to try and get more balanced understanding on both sides, both the good, the bad, and also what Europe and North American companies are doing and governments are doing, both the good and bad. And then just finally, the governance issue is an old problem. We inherited this from the Cold War. And I think I completely agree with Hannah. It is only Africans that will solve that. And any sort of value-driven, lecturing from the global north often, it's just not going to work because it's now our problem.
Bright, are you there? Bright, can you hear me? Bright seems to be dropping off and coming back. Yushan, I'm going to come to you for intervention.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Hopefully we'll get Bright back on the line, and then Bright will come back to you, and you will get the last word.
Yeah, sure. I think just to add to this idea, this discussion on the transfer of models, etc. I think, you know, we so often focus on the high politics and the business aspect of relations, and I mean, we often talk about, you know, China engaging Africa purely from an economic or self-interest perspective, but I suppose African states are similarly, you know, engaging from an economic perspective. And I think, you know, when we look at this discussion of models, I mean, it, like Hannah said, it's not so simple. You know, I often say that what is really missing in this relationship is understanding of tacit knowledge. So it's not just the technology or
Thanks. We seem to have lost your audio, Yushan. I don't know what's happened. Peter, are you there? We seem to have lost your audio, Yushan. I don't think she's muted. Yushan, can you hear us? Bright, so we're coming to you. The question for you, did you hear the question before, Bright?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Sorry, Yushan, we can't hear you. Go for it, Bright.
Yeah, so I definitely think the relationship has more dimension to it, as has been expressed, than just the economic aspects. Although that happens to be the side that seems to be the side that is most focused on. I remember several times seeing Ghanaian politicians or Ghanaian political leaders speaking to the economic benefits of such a relationship. Especially once when you know one Chinese woman who was very notorious for this same mining issue had been arrested, and instead of being made to face whatever the laws had been determined to be punishment, was allowed to leave. And when the minister in charge was asked, he blatantly said that you know, trying her in Ghana was not going to solve our economic issues. So it seems like the economic benefits of whatever this relationship is has been the side that has largely been focused on. And with my work, I've tried also to explore other aspects of it, especially when it comes to censorship and how the general media reports on some of all these issues. There's an aspect of my work where I sometimes say it serves as an alternate source of history or memory, because right after the time when the Chinese diplomats would complain around about how, you know, stories involving their nationals were being carried in the media, it seemed like the reporting strategy changed, and some of these stories would not last beyond a day or two, and then they would vanish. So personally, in my work, I always try to look for some of these stories that you know, look at other aspects beyond just the economic aspect, or especially stories that I know, you know, be due to censorship would not survive in the media, and try to highlight that in my work as a way of, you know, generating discourse, encouraging other Ghanaians to demand that much needed accountability from, you know, the Ghanaian politicians whenever they go into these kind of dealings with the Chinese or with whoever, because I think you know, demanding and getting accountability is one big sign of that agency that we've heard so much about today.
Thanks so much, Bright. Yushan, are you there? Let's see if we can get your audio working.
Yes, I'm here. I'm not sure when I was cut off, but
give us the whole thing again.
No, I think the main thing I wanted to say was that I think we focus a lot on, of course, the high politics and the economic relationship, which is important. I think there is still the need to build tacit knowledge between both sides. And I think a lot of us who work in the space know that. I mean, I think governments have been active and trying to create people exchanges and student exchanges, etc. But the question is really when this relationship can also move beyond government motivation to spark, I suppose, a life of its own as well. Yeah,
Thanks
I'll leave
so
it
much.
there. Thanks.
Thanks. I think that's a really great point to end on. Just two quick thoughts for me. I mean, one is that some of the really interesting research, I think, on policy diffusion, which I think was the question that may have been thrown at Hannah, has also pointed to other models, right? I mean, I think a nice piece by El Safuri in African Affairs a while back pointed out that Kenya's policymakers in coming up with Vision 2030 didn't look to China, they looked to Malaysia, as have a number of other African governments. So it's not just one model, right? There's multiple models. And just because you think China might have certain aspects, it doesn't mean that African policymakers aren't thinking in fairly sophisticated ways about what would be the best model for them. And that might often not be seen to be China. I think in the case of Kenya, they felt that Malaysia was at a more kind of appropriate stage of development for Kenya to be able to apply its models. So I think that's something that we need to think about as well, how many different models there are in this space. And I think also, in that point you made at the end about mutual knowledge, and needing to think a little bit about, where do people's experiences come from? I guess for a lot of Africans, especially perhaps living in rural areas and peri-urban areas, your contact might be with Chinese traders, Chinese business people, rather than the Chinese state in any way. Similarly, when I was talking to some Chinese government representatives a couple of years ago, one of the points they made was that they often felt that they didn't have enough knowledge about the African context in which they were operating to be more interventionist. And one of their points was, yes, it's a point of principle, but it's also partly because we don't think we understand well enough yet, but that will develop because of the investment that we're putting into everything from learning experiences and trainings. And one of their predictions was that they might potentially be slightly less, as it were, non-interventionist in the future, which is when they feel that they have more confidence in their own knowledge of the context, which I think is something particularly interesting for us to look for. So I think all of those points you guys made at the end about mutual learning and information and the extent to which there's actually understanding on both sides is really important. Of course, it's also worth saying that much of what we assume is shared in terms of knowledge between the West and Africa is also based on, as some of you have pointed out, myths and lies, right? And so sometimes, I actually think that it might be better to approach it from a position of assumed ignorance rather than assuming you know everything about a country because of a shared colonial past that might not actually be based on a very accurate understanding of that history, as Nzetsi was putting out in terms of the Cold War legacy and so on. On that note, thank you so much to our wonderful speakers and our brilliant discussant. Sorry, everyone, for the technical issues, and I'm throwing it back to Jeff and Mantade to close us down.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's always a challenge when you're producing a show with participants and folks from 3 different continents and I believe 8 different countries today. So thanks to everyone for sticking with us. I think we made it, and I certainly learned a lot. I hope you all did too. But as Nick said, that's all the time we have for now. Once again, a special shout out to our panel of experts for a remarkably well done job. Our team at the Resistance Bureau definitely looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you and to highlighting the important work and the research that you do moving forward. And of course, thanks to our audience for engaging with us and for tuning in today. The comments on YouTube, on Facebook, and on our chat here have been super to see coming through. So thank you for that and continued engagement. We hope, of course, to keep seeing you here in the future as we have some excellent show topics in the works. These will include, for example, some special shows around the upcoming US-Africa Leaders Summit, which is set to take place in September. So definitely stay tuned for that and much, much more. And of course, please stay in touch with us by visiting our new and improved website, theresistancebureau.com, and by subscribing on our homepage to get updates on the program, as well as show summaries and participant videos from today's show and past shows. On our website, you can also revisit those past shows, all of which are saved and free to download in the episodes section. You can also search for us on Apple Podcasts to download our shows there, so you can listen to any time. We're on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Yes, we have all your bases covered. As a final note, the impact of this program is testament to the efforts of our entire team, so big thanks, as always, to our tech manager, Peter Dory, and to our creative director, Ndondwa Msaka, who both work behind the scenes to make the Resistance Bureau a continued success. Thank you again for joining us today. We truly, really appreciate it. Stay safe in the meantime. Keep fighting those good fights, and we'll see you out there.